lovely to be here and to have the opportunity to share with you. And I'd just like to thank Julie for the leadership that she's provided in terms of the research that we've been involved in, and also for the invitation to come today. It is a real privilege for me, and I'm looking forward to learning from you also. So briefly today, we're going to draw on the experience that I've had and staff who've worked with me have had in working on the front line of disasters, and I'm specifically referring to Centrelink social workers. I'll touch on that briefly. And you can see from the slide the sorts of things that I'm hoping to touch on, including the challenges, the lessons learned, and some outcomes of the research that we've been involved in. But before I do that, boats are washed ashore, houses without roofs, windows smashed in, trees torn out of the ground, and those that do remain standing are bare and lifeless. The wind gusts were so ferocious they sounded like freight trains passing by. The concrete walls were shaking non-stop all day. Evacuations were hampered by continued bad weather. That happened on Tuesday in the state in which I live. And while it happened 1,200 kilometres away from where I live, 1,200 kilometres north, it's something that impacts me personally because I know the area, I know the environment, and I have a passion for supporting people who've been impacted by disasters. So Cyclone Debbie, such similarities with what Robin was talking about in terms of how it impacts for people. So Centrelink, at the time of the Bali bombings, was the Australian Government Service Delivery Agency responsible for the payment and administration of pensions, unemployment, sickness and special benefits payments and services. It had a role in emergency management plans at the national, state and local level in relation to ensuring the continuity of payments to existing clients, and also in administering ex gratia payments that the Government of Australia might decide it wished to pay for those impacted by various disasters. This involved deploying staff to affected areas and providing assistance based in tents, community hubs or other recovery infrastructure established for this purpose. As part of its commitment, Centrelink, which had at the time a staff of about 25,000 and a social work component of that, which was about, in 2002, was around 600 social workers, and I managed the social work service across Australia for that. The social workers were actually involved in assisting our staff who were making payments to clients to actually assist with those people who were extremely distressed or who had real issues in actually being able to access the services that Centrelink provided, but also to work with the state and territory government staff who had primary roles in providing assistance in situations of disaster, particularly in the recovery effort. Centrelink social workers might also be used as members of outreach teams established by the state or at times by the Australian Red Cross to visit those affected who still remained in their homes to ensure their safety and welfare and provide any necessary referral or assistance. In 2002, on the 12th of October, there were 2 bombs that went off in the holiday island, very popular for Australians for vacation, at the Sari Club and across the road at Paddy's Bar. 202 people were killed in that bombing, and 88 of those were Australian citizens. A further 20 people were killed in the 2005 Bali bombings, including 4 Australians. This was the first time that terrorism had really touched Australia, and it resulted in an incredible response from the Australian government. Initially, after a phone call from the CEO of my agency, She told me that her minister, the government minister responsible, had had a conversation with her, and she in turn said, my social work service of 500 plus social workers is available, and the minister's response to that, which then came to me, was make that happen. Now, there were many agencies involved, and our particular responsibility was to set up a case management service for people onshore, families of those who'd been killed and survivors and their families, as a safety net, because a number of other agencies were actually providing case management services, but the Australian government provided a very extensive package of assistance, and our role as social workers was to really truly case manage and coordinate the services so the people who wish to access them would have minimal impact in terms of poor service integration. In May 2003, the trial of the Bali bombers started, and the Australian government funded any family members who wished to attend to go to Bali for 7 days to attend a part of the trial. Already in Bali there were Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade officials who were there anyway but had their numbers supplemented, and the Australian Federal Police working closely with the Indonesian National Police. And what they lacked, what the service gap was some people who could provide actual social support to those who were affected, who wished to attend. And so I was asked to set up in very short notice an offshore service provision. That resulted in many challenges, not the least in asking staff to go and work in an environment that was entirely unfamiliar, but more importantly, was subject to ongoing bomb threats. And for me, that was one of the most terrible responsibilities to have. Jurisdictional challenges, because different countries do things in different ways, and managing expectations of families about how things should happen was a major role. And working closely with the Department of Foreign Affairs and the Australian Federal Police and really carving out quite a separate but complementary role was quite challenging. That began a series of deployments, and I won't read them all. You can see them on the screen there, and I know those on the webinar have access to the PowerPoint. But there were many deployments, both immediately after disasters, at anniversary commemorations, and over the 10 years that I was in that national manager role, these events occurred, and we learned much. One of those was the Yogyakarta plane crash in which 4 Australians were killed, and 3 of them were Commonwealth public servants, one of whom we knew from the Bali experience. Onshore, we had many deployments, and our involvement in responding to disasters was many years prior to 2002. And so our 2002 onward experience built on what we'd learned as well from previous involvement. But you can see droughts, bushfires, floods, cyclones. In fact, last week the state in which I live was 90% drought declared, and now it's subject to much flooding. So our strategic role and aim in relation to a social work response has been to contribute positively to affected people's ability to move to a new normal after a disaster, and I'll talk a bit more about that later. But our overarching role is really to help bring order out of chaos, because disaster events are incredibly chaotic. With the best of intentions and the best organisation, there is great chaos in those early days. And most importantly, to help people regain control of their lives. So the challenges that we've learned about, and Robin's reflected some of these, how do you actually give voice to communities who may be overwhelmed? And I think that's a really strategic challenge for social workers. An acronym, FIFO. We have a lot of fly-in, fly-out workers in Australia, and so we've developed this acronym, and Because I ran a national service, when disasters happened and the local or state services were overwhelmed, I was in a position to fly social workers in from other parts of Australia to assist with the response. But the challenge there was that they didn't know the local community or have the relationships. Cultural context, both offshore and on, and it's not just ethnically based. There's the rural-urban differences. Community cultures themselves are quite unique, and having some understanding or trying to develop some understanding of that was important. The gender differences in response and the jurisdictional differences. Who's actually in charge? It's really important to understand that. You know, what is within your power to change or influence, because if you don't understand that, you can get yourself into a lot of trouble, has been my experience. Every disaster is different and requires a tailored response, the best blueprint in the world. I've got 5 minutes, I better hurry. Okay. An assessment of need is dynamic. The role of the media and how they are managed can impact significantly on recovery. I'll just keep flicking through those because I want to get to making sure you have the right staff, and I'd refer you to that slide. Critical times, anniversaries in particular, but a range of other issues that can actually make it incredibly difficult for people to recover. Talking about the Black Saturday bushfire, this was the largest natural disaster that had happened in Australia since Federation, which was in 1901. So we had 173 people who lost their lives, and you can see from the slide the extent of the damage that occurred. And so how did I apply my learnings to establishing a case management service, which the Prime Minister of Australia and the Premier of Victoria announced very soon after the bushfire occurred on the 7th of February. I was able to bring my experience of case management together with the 2 Victorian Department of Human Service executives who were tasked to actually get this up and running. It so happened they were social workers. We shared a common purpose, we pursued role clarity, and we were able to use existing networks and collaborate. You can see what else was important, but I just draw your attention to the importance of governance, staffing and staff support. If you're going to provide a helpful service, you need to make sure that you've got structures in place, and that has to happen fairly quickly. So the research we were involved in with Julie was undertaken in a community called Kinglake on a mountain ridge about an hour and a half outside of Melbourne. In summary, there were different experiences and outcomes for different people. Recognise the significance of place was incredibly important, and the meaning that place has for people. There are still some with significant mental health issues and a lot of anger still in the community. Social workers often ill-prepared for the scale of the disaster, and they may be affected themselves and experiencing loss and may experience that vicarious trauma. People in the bushfire zone talked about the secondary injury of the response, that there were things that happened in the response that actually caused more injury than the bushfire themselves. And you can see the rush to restore place and the resource redistribution or distribution can actually reinforce existing inequalities. That new normal, recovery to the old normal is not possible, so there is a new normal that people have to move to. Politics intervenes at all levels in the recovery process. It's not just the politicians. Politics within community, politics within families at times is something that's really important to be aware of. And there are significant gender differences in the response. The role of community development is really important, and sometimes I think as social workers that we lose sight of that when we're trying to ensure that we're helping individuals, but there's that longer term community development process that needs to occur, and how social workers can play a role in assisting communities and individuals within communities to have a voice in that recovery process is really important. So understanding the link between people, place and environment is really significant. Practical case management is essential. It helps to build rapport. Self-care and support, also essential, and we argue that social work in disaster should actually be included in social work curricula. I'm almost finished, but I'll just read this wee bit. So for staff working in the recovery context, the basic premise must be do no harm. This can be very challenging when decisions, processes and activities go on in the context of recovery, and they often exclude those affected. As social workers, it's very important to not assume that you know what is most important for people. They're the experts in their own lives, so acknowledging and working with that understanding is essential. Negotiating a voice for affected people becomes an important but often very difficult task for social workers in that context. In disaster contexts, competing priorities and at times competition for scarce resources can actually create relationship tensions amongst agencies. One of the key principles is to work collaboratively and to understand and be respectful of each other's roles, as no one agency or person can do it all. I'd argue that collaborative and integrated services are critical in supporting those affected by disaster and reinforce the principle of do no harm. Life goes on after a disaster, but often for those affected, when the disaster moves off the front page, hope can turn to despair. Support services can be time limited. Usual social support networks can sometimes become exhausted with the need for ongoing support. So understanding and being responsive to that becomes important for social workers engaged in longer term work. Advocacy for example, for a continuation of service funding, doing this in conjunction with those affected with other agencies may be a critical role at that time. So as social workers responding to people and communities impacted by disasters and climate change events, the role becomes one of relevance. How do you help people create meaning and hope in what is often experienced as a hopeless situation? It's a humbling experience and a privilege when people allow you to walk beside them in their pain. As social workers, we need to respect that. People and communities react in different ways at different times to a disaster. It's important to be informed by a body of professional knowledge and experience, but equally, it's important to respond to people at the point and pace they choose to engage. Thank you very much. I'll have to let